I am so excited to introduce to you today Dr. Chase Cummins. He has a doctorate in clinical psychology. He's also certified as the master practitioner in neuro-linguistic programming, mental and emotional release, and hypnotherapy. Quite a broad range of uh, modalities there. Chase has been supporting kids, teens, and parents who suffer from from various challenges for 10 plus years. He specializes in working with parents to enhance family dynamics to create collaborative, harmonious, and fun-filled lifestyles. What a great purpose, Chase.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here, Nancy.
You remember experiencing anxiety even as a very young child. How did that impact you and how did you handle it as a child?
Yeah, that's a really good question. As a kid, I, well, I think for anyone, having feelings of anxiousness and worry can be really difficult. And as a kid, I just remember all these feelings of self-doubt that would kind of creep in. And I would just kind of learn to always question myself. And I was thoroughly self-reflective to a fault where I was starting to just kind of look for any little piece that I could criticize about myself. And yeah, and it was a pretty difficult thing. And thankfully, just naturally, I'd say it was more by luck. I kind of found some other coping mechanisms to support myself during that time. So things weren't always so awful and difficult and challenging, but especially throughout school, I remember feeling so often that like overwhelming sense of dread and just feeling like so worried and panicked. And then I'd start to over prepare for things and was just constantly ruminating about like everything that was going on or thinking about. I remember like a slogan I would kind of say to myself: I'd hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. And at the time, I remember thinking that that was a really helpful thought to have or a helpful belief. And it really wasn't until I was older where I started reflecting and noticing a lot of these patterns. It's like, you know what? I don't think that was really helpful to just always, because if you're always preparing for the worst, you're kind of expecting the worst to happen. Where there versus if you focus more so on a lot of the positives or what do I want to get out of this experience, rather than how do I not want to feel? How do I want to feel when I'm showing up and giving a speech or when I'm talking with people around me? And so over the years, I found healthier ways to really shift a lot of that old programming to come to a much healthier space.
As an adult and with all the training that you've had, can you look back on your life as a child and identify what started that negative self-judgment pattern in you?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think it's I think it's a tough question to answer because sometimes something that I've learned in my studies, and I remember I had a professor say something and I felt like it had just really clicked for me or it was more so resonating, was that like sometimes when there are things happening in our environment uh, that might be like, let's just say, for example, if a child were to think that they were growing up in a really dangerous or chaotic environment, then that means that the fear will be ongoing. That it's kind of like, let's say if you were living with a bear, it's like that bear could kind of be there to attack. And it would just kind of be like really frightening as a child. And so with a lot of kids, and I think this kind of happened with me, rather than kind of recognizing that there were certain things in my environment that just couldn't change, there I guess the way that my brain chose to perceive things was that, it's not the environment that has a problem. Maybe it's me that has the problem. So then it gave me a little more ownership and power to think like, okay, well, maybe if I focus on bettering myself, like the things around me will start to improve. And so, yeah, in the short term, I think that was a really helpful, like an adaptive belief that, because because it gave me hope that things can improve over time. But then ultimately, it's like, when you look back and you're like, oh my goodness, there were just so many years of self doubt and feelings of guilt and shame that were just like so flooding, to then step back and be like, I don't think I was ever the problem. I think there were just other factors happening around me that were just too confusing for a kid to really understand. Um, yeah, but as for like what really created that environment, I feel like that really is just a tough thing to answer, because yeah, so I feel like it could be a number of things, but I think ultimately it was just, as a kid, it felt like there were a lot of things out of my control, and that was just my brain's way of trying to seek understanding with something that I just couldn't quite understand.
I, I don't know if you would agree with this statement or not, but I find that children tend to blame themselves when there's a lack in their environment. Their needs are not being met in a way that makes sense to them. I know that my parents were wonderful in many ways, but they weren't good at creating emotional support for me or for my sisters. And I assumed that to mean that I was unlovable. And it
Mm,
was well into my adult years before I could look back and realize it wasn't that I was unlovable, it's that my parents loved me to the to the degree of their ability. And
mm,
it wasn't as much as I needed or wasn't delivered in the ways I needed it. So I assumed somehow that was my fault.
yeah, I will say there's certainly a big part of that that resonates, because within my home environment, I've always felt and known, the deep core that my parents and family always loved me. Like there was always a lot of love around. But I do think there's a part to what you just mentioned about, not only are you loved, but are you receiving love in the way that you need it to feel fully loved? Um, yeah, because I think growing up as a male in society, I know there were also experiences that happened outside of my family dynamic that kind of reinforced this message that like it wasn't okay for me to have these negative feelings, or it wasn't okay to talk about these things. Like I remember a time when I think it was when I was about 4 or 5 years old, that I joined a baseball team, as a part of like Little League. And I
Yes.
remember it was one of my first times going up to hit the ball. I hit it and I started running towards first base, and I got so excited I just lost my footing. And I remember falling and scraping up my knee. And just as a little kid, I remember my eyes started to well up and I was about to cry. And my coach looked at me and just got like a little frustrated and upset and was like, "Boys, don't cry, get up, brush yourself off, and keep running." And yeah, and I think, as a little kid, like if we were to hear those things, like those things have really deep messages that we
Yes.
may not even recognize in the moment, but it certainly has an impact on our processing or how we'll, interact with others in the future. Because yeah, there was definitely a pattern throughout my life where I just felt like it was never okay for me to express my feelings, because it seemed like things would become a little more worse or even chaotic if I were to do that.
It's so unfortunate that that's such a consistent message that many males get in our society. It's really very tragic, actually. You define,
Absolutely.
you define anxiety as different than normal nervousness. What is the difference?
Yeah, I like that, because I've gotten to experience that, certainly on a personal level, but also with a lot of the clients that I've worked with. Because like you mentioned, I've worked with kids for a number of years and with parents, and I've seen, we're all human and we all have essentially the same feelings from time to time. And so when it comes to simple nervousness, there are some things that we might do in our life that will inherently generate a little bit of stress or anxiousness or worry, and that's normal. So, really, when we think about how the body will adapt to change, like any change in our environment or any new task put onto our plate, does trigger a little bit of a stress response in our body. And so, when it comes to feeling a little worried or nervous, that just might mean, um, or how I might think about it is, when things are important to us, and if we want something to go well, we might feel a little worried that it may not go well because we want something to go well, right? Or maybe we're doing something new for the first time, and whenever we're going through the stages of learning, there's this like conscious incompetent zone where we're aware that we're not very good at something, but nonetheless we're going to try because it's our first time doing something, and maybe it'll go well and maybe it won't. So it's just kind of this, when we're really in any state of uncertainty, it might bring up some feelings where we're a little uncomfortable. But ultimately, when we do have this normal amount of nervousness, really it should be the emotion that we experience should be for a fairly short duration of time, and that feeling should go away after we've completed the task. Now, so when it comes to that clinical piece of anxiety, it's really when those feelings of anxiousness, worry, fear, panic, when those are lasting with us. So when it's really persistent and prevalent, and it's lasting for a really long time, and no matter what we do, it seems like it's really difficult to control or manage that anxiety to the point where it really starts negatively impacting us in a lot of different areas of our life.
So clinical anxiety is where it's interfering with your ability to cope with your life, where nervousness is a momentary, smaller degree of anxiety because you may be doing something new or you have a presentation, something like that.
Exactly.
I appreciate you clarifying the difference. Also, I appreciated your strategy of setting small goals practiced when preparing for your dissertation. Like, complete a dissertation is an enormous goal, but you broke it up into smaller pieces in order to cope with the anxiety of having that much pressure on you. What are some other strategies that helped you with that big accomplishment?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I will say that that piece of breaking things up into smaller chunks really is a helpful one, especially for anxiety, because for someone that might be a little more prone to feeling anxious, or where smaller, medium-sized stressors might be perceived as like a really big stressor, because I kind of think about it, any task might be perceived as this enormous mountain. Like, how can we possibly climb and overcome this mountain? And really, it's like just by taking it one step at a time. And so, yeah, kind of breaking things into smaller chunks. And then rather than, say if we do that and we see we have 20 different steps, that's still fairly overwhelming to think, how am I going to do this? But just starting at one step at a time is certainly one way to make it much more manageable. Something that I tend to speak about with everyone, especially any new clients that come in, is the power of deep breathing. I had a colleague who's now a really good friend of mine. We were in a meeting once and she shared that it took her a year to learn how to breathe. She was a yoga teacher and she also worked with clients. And I remember thinking that seemed kind of ridiculous. What do you mean it took a year to learn how to breathe? I was like, you're breathing right now. Like, you breathed your entire life. What are you talking about? But after I really stepped into the power of deep breathing, I learned what she meant by that. That really it took her a year to learn how to focus her uncomfortable emotions through her breath. So like through her exhales, she could really learn to expunge or get rid of those uncomfortable feelings that she was holding on to. And so that was certainly something that I learned to do as well. So just taking really full, slow breaths, focusing on a longer exhale, because it's that longer exhale that triggers the central nervous system that you're safe and you're okay. Like your body, your heart rate will start to respond positively to that, where it'll start to decrease pumping. So physiologically, you feel calmer. And I think it's kind of a two birds with one stone experience, where if we are intentionally focusing on our breath, whatever our mind was racing on, if we are ruminating about a task, a project, a conversation we need to have, just by focusing our attention on our breath, it gives your brain a little bit of a break from actually ruminating, which is a really healthy thing. Like, if we're stuck in that cycle where we're just ruminating about an issue and we're panicking, and then we keep ruminating and it's not helping, or sometimes, that cycle might look like something happens, you panic, you avoid, and then all of a sudden a new trigger comes and it reminds you of, oh my goodness, I forgot about that one thing. What am I doing? And then the panic gets even worse, especially when we're in a cycle of avoiding things. So deep breathing is a great way to give yourself more control within the situation. Because yeah, our body, we can't control our emotional responses, but we can intentionally do things with our body to at least help our body process that emotion. There's a number of things that I think can be really helpful. Like other things that I personally love doing from time to time would be meditating, talking with friends and family, going into nature, like whether that's a hike or even just going on a really short neighborhood walk. It's really anything to get into a new environment can be really healthy for ourselves. Other big things, like I live here on the big island of Hawaii, so it can be very sunny. And, research shows that sunlight is very healthy for our mental health. So taking a little bit of time to go into the sun, they usually say about 20 minutes of sunlight per day is really helpful and useful. And then maybe like one other little thing that I think would be, I say little, it is difficult, but with practice, it comes more naturally. But learning to challenge your own negative self-talk. So I think that's been a really big one for me in my journey, just because again, there was this negative voice in my head that was just constantly critiquing, and really it took me learning to pause and notice that I was having a negative thought and start to learn to challenge it. Like, if I said I wasn't good enough to do something, like, wait a sec, what makes me say that? Like, why do I have any evidence to think that I'm not good enough to do that? Has someone else done this before? So if someone else can do it, maybe it's possible for me to do it. So rather than being stuck in this limited state, helping move myself to a place where there's more freedom and possibility, which is a much more empowering place that I personally want to be. And I think other people would probably want to be in that place too.
I think that's been all the things that you've mentioned I do regularly, but challenging my negative self-talk has been an ongoing lesson. It's like moment by moment, I need to pay attention to what I'm telling myself and asking, is that really true? Just
Yeah.
valuable question that I ask myself.
And I think that's a good point, just because we're people that have a lot of tools and a lot of strategies for our own mental health and well-being. And even then, like, it still takes a lot of consistency and intention to make sure we're actively remembering to do a lot of these things. In the hope, which is tricky. Life gets busy. And I think one of the best things that we can do that can really help with that is, we can only have our focus and energy can only do so much. And something that can really help is when we establish routines. So if we have a routine of, always working out in the morning or having like Tuesday coffee dates with a friend, then we have all these proactive things set up in our schedule that we know are going to be really healthy and helpful for our own mental health. So you're kind of proactively meeting your needs before things are thoroughly escalating to the point where you're like, oh no, I need my coping mechanisms right now.
One of the best things I ever did for myself was set up a Sunday afternoon date with friends to play table games. It's just a wonderful break for my brain, as well as the community that I enjoy. I believe many of us share your reluctance to ask for help. How do you deal with that reluctance?
Oh, that can be a really tough one. And I've noticed that it really depends, like someone's culture really has a big influence on that. Yes. So within the United States, we tend to have what we call a more individualistic culture, where there's such a, like, overall, we tend to value family fairly highly. And there's more of an emphasis often placed on our own individual needs and making sure that we do what's best for ourselves, because the belief is that, if we do what's best for ourselves, then that's what's best for everyone else. So we can show up more positively, be more helpful for others, which can be great. So I feel like sometimes when we come from an individualistic culture, it can be a little easier to ask for help. Living in Hawaii, there tends to be a lot more collectivism, or this collectivistic culture where there's a much greater value of family or like the larger society, where it's like the needs of the group often outweigh the needs of the individual. And I've noticed like sometimes there might be even more shame or guilt at the idea of seeking help. Like the belief in a collectivistic culture is that the problems or the challenges should stay within the family because the family is meant to be a really close, protected unit where the family helps others in the family, versus kind of like airing your dirty laundry for everyone to hear, or excuse me, for everyone to see. So what can help with help seeking? I think what can help is building awareness around what you think you're needing, whether that's, and sometimes we can answer that question and sometimes that can be a really tough one. What I would hope is that, you know, someone has at least one close individual that you can go to, whether that's a friend or a family member, that you can at least have someone to bounce ideas off of, because sometimes even just sharing what we're going through with a friend can be a really healing experience. Like I know I've had friends come to me and after I shared what I was going through, and they'd say, oh yeah, that's a really difficult experience. So just getting that little bit of validation can be really helpful. And then sometimes we may not have someone that we feel like it's safe to go to. And I feel like that's where there's a lot of power in mental health providers, because there is this piece of confidentiality that you essentially can fully open up and share, you know, the good, the bad, and the ugly of what's going on in your life, and know for the most part that things will be confidential. Like unless there's any risk of harm to self or others, that's kind of the one big thing where, you know, confidentiality might be broken. But for the most part, when it comes to your own unique needs, like having a mental health provider can be really helpful.
I think we all need a mental health provider on our fast call on our phones. Like to make it a lot more normalized and not as much resistance to asking for help from a professional. I noticed the name of your website is My Introspective Solution. I'm wondering how you came up with that name.
Ooh, that's a good question. Well, so the company Introspective Solutions, it's one that my wife and I started. And ultimately, what came about from that was for both of us, as we've just reflected on our life and through a lot of our training and education that we've received, we've noticed there's this theme that's really helpful when you go introspective. So often the beliefs that we have about ourselves or others really help shape the world that we live in. So, you know, if we fully believe that I'm a bad person, my unconscious mind will start looking for examples in my life to prove, yes, I'm not a good person. So if we can learn to, like I said, start to challenge a lot of those thoughts to develop healthier, more constructive, positive beliefs about ourselves or beliefs about others, then that will actually shift our reality to become a more positive, a positive place, a positive experience for everyone, really.
Mm-hmm.
So for us, it was more, we have noticed that it's been really helpful for us and a lot of the clients that we've worked with in the past to engage in a lot of introspection and learn more about your own motivation and your reasons for why you do what you did. And with that, like with that awareness, then it can help you make more positive decisions in the present to then create a more successful or ideal future for yourself.
I love that idea. I love the name. And if you'd like to reach out to Dr. Chase Cummins, you can reach him on his website, myintrospectivesolution.com. I want to thank you for spending some time with me here today. You did a wonderful job with the written interview on Authority Magazine. I recommend anyone who's watching this video also go to Authority Magazine, look up Dr. Chase Cummins and his article that was recently published called Strategies for Effective Mental Well-Being. Thank you again. I'm going to stop the recording and then I wonder if we could speak for a moment afterwards.
Absolutely.